Donald Trump says Russia will face severe consequences if it doesn't end the war with Ukraine. The US president has outlined his plans for talks with Vladimir Putin, claiming he wants a second meeting with the Russian leader straight after their bilateral talks in Alaska. The president is adamant the second meeting would be determined by progress on a ceasefire.
It was always going to be, I was going to meet with President Putin, and then after that I'm going to call the leaders and President Zelensky. I'm going to call President Zelensky, and then I'll call, probably in that order, the leaders. There's a very good chance that we're going to have a second meeting, which will be more productive than the first, because the first is I'm going to find out where we are and what we're doing. If the first one goes okay, we'll have a quick second one. I would like to do it almost immediately, and we'll have a quick second meeting between President Putin and President Zelensky and myself, if they'd like to have me there.
Donald Trump held an emergency summit with Ukraine's Volodymyr Zelensky and European leaders overnight. The meeting was one of the last chances for Europe to pitch their concerns to the US president, who hold fears a ceasefire deal could sell out Ukraine's interests.
Putin is also bluffing, saying that he doesn't care about the sanctions and that they're not working. In reality, the sanctions are very effective and they're hurting the Russian military economy. Russia does have much more artillery and weapons, but Russia has 3 times as many losses. This is a fact. I told my colleagues and the United States President and my European friends that Putin doesn't want peace. He wants to occupy our country.
That was part of his trip to Germany, and Siobhan Robbins from Sky has more from Berlin.
This meeting was so important because basically it was potentially the last chance the European allies and Ukraine had to lay out their red lines to Donald Trump ahead of that meeting. And we heard from Friedrich Merz, the German Chancellor, afterwards what some of those red lines were. So, for example, a ceasefire had to be the start. There shouldn't be any other awards being given to Putin before an immediate ceasefire, that Ukraine's security must be guaranteed, that the security of Europe had to be upheld as well. And they went along to say that if at the end of this meeting that President Putin didn't appear to be showing really any commitment to a proper ceasefire, then they all agreed that maximum pressure should be put on him, and that could include further sanctions from the US. Now, the question is, are they really all on the same page? And certainly the thing that we were being told from that meeting was that they all seem to be in agreement on most things. But I think the big problem is that Donald Trump can agree to something one day and the next day go into a room and talk from a totally different script. And it was interesting being in that room again with President Zelensky, because I've seen him here so many times in Berlin, and his body language after that call was really different. When he arrived, he looked quite relaxed, meeting Friedrich Merz on the lawn. When he was standing in that press conference, he looked quite tense. And that's possibly because he's furious about the fact that there is a meeting happening without Ukraine. And that was another point that they made. Ukraine has to be involved in any talks about its future going forward. But also because he really believes that President Putin has no intention at all of moving towards peace. He said that President Putin's only intention is to try to occupy the whole of Ukraine. And so I think while we're hearing from allies like the UK that there's now potentially even a viable chance of a ceasefire if things go to plan, there's still so much up in the air. And one of those is really dependent on the fact that it is Donald Trump sitting one-on-one in that room with President Putin. And he is a character who changes like the wind.
Well, let's switch things over to the United States now for more reaction. Here's David Blevins.
Yes, it's quite difficult to read the strategy in the run-up to the summit on Friday. He says if the meeting between himself and Putin goes well, there will be a second meeting very quickly between Putin, Zelensky and possibly himself. But given that we know he's told European leaders today that he will try to broker a ceasefire, the if in that sentence is doing a lot of heavy lifting. Because what he's really saying is if he manages to broker a ceasefire on Friday, then there would be a second meeting to discuss territory. But Donald Trump knows himself that is a huge question. He's even conceding that he may not be able to persuade the Russian president to stop targeting civilians. And while he wouldn't be drawn on the nature of any sanctions, he said the consequences will be severe if Russia continues with the war. Now, even if he manages to achieve the seemingly impossible and persuades Vladimir Putin to agree a truce, a halt to the fighting, it's very difficult to envisage an agreement on territory when Volodymyr Zelensky is warning Donald Trump that Vladimir Putin is bluffing, in his opinion, that he wants the entire front along the battle lines in Ukraine and doesn't want to return any of the land that he's already annexed. As Siobhan was saying, in the space of a week, Donald Trump has gone from talking up the potential for a deal involving a swapping of territory to tempering expectations. The White House describing this as just a listening exercise, a fact-finding exercise on Friday, to him now again talking up the potential for a ceasefire. And I think that tells us just how fluid the situation is in the background negotiations in the run-up to Friday's summit. He said that the meeting on Friday was setting the table for a second meeting, but that's a little bit presumptuous to set the table when you haven't cooked the meal yet.